Folks, good morning and welcome to week 2 of lockdown in Swaziland. I hope you're well and holding on and enjoying the walk to Jerusalem. We come this morning to Psalm 125 and perhaps take a moment before we continue just to read and meditate on those 5 verses. And then I want you to think about a tightrope walker. Did you ever watch a guy called Nick Walenda? In 2012, he crossed the Niagara Falls on a tightrope, holding that balancing stick. And I just wonder if you ever saw that footage, the mist rising around him, the roar of the falls, and wondered, what a crazy thing to do. And then the following year, he did something even more outrageous. He crossed the Grand Canyon without a safety harness and no safety net. It was drone footage of that event. You can look it up on YouTube. Just incredible hearing him pray as he steps out across the abyss. Can you imagine the updraft and maybe the line snaking as he moved to the center of the canyon? I want to ask you this morning, how precarious is your walk along the path of faith? How sure is your foothold? Are you able to stride out confidently with your head held high, or are you worried about falling? The question that comes to mind, has God really got me? Are His arms really underneath? Sometimes it seems that life as a Christian is walking a tightrope and people are watching with bated breath, waiting to see you fall. Do you feel like that? Have you felt like that? This morning, Psalm 125 assures us that despite the perils, despite the dangers, our Christian walk is as secure as sitting in a mountain fortress. Did you see verse 1? Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be shaken, but endures forever. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so Yahweh surrounds His people both now and forevermore. I'm so happy we live in Mbabane. It's a little like Jerusalem, kind of in a saucer surrounded by hills. And Jerusalem was considered safe because of the protection of those hills. If you're on your way to work or on your way to school, do you ever look up to those hills? Because they remind us that God surrounds us like hills that encircle the city. Better than any city wall, better than a military fort, is the presence of the Lord our God. And you'll remember Psalm 46 verse 1. He is our refuge. He is our strength and ever-present help in trouble. We need to know that, because we do get anxious. We do become uncertain and insecure. The confident faith that we'd all love to have is punctuated, by uncertain moments. And Psalm 125 takes a look at 2 different threats to our security. The first one is right there in verse 1. The person of faith described as someone who can't be shaken. Let me tell you something, I am shaken. One day I'm full of faith, the next day full of doubt. One moment I wake up with all the joys, the next day I'm feeling miss. Cannot be shaken? Nothing could be less true of me. Joy, sadness, success, failure, all those things shake me. I'm like the mercury in a thermometer, up one day, down the next. But you know what? So was Israel. Up one day and down the next. One day walking through the Red Sea, singing the songs of victory. The next day grumbling about their lost Egyptian stake. One day marching around the walls of Jericho, the next dancing around some Canaanite idol. One day listening to Jesus in the upper room, sharing in the bread and the wine. The next day they're cursing and denying that they ever knew him. What's the common denominator in those scenarios? Not the Israelites, not the disciples, not even our feelings. The common denominator is God. Amen. He's always there. No matter how mercurial we are, no matter how up and down, we remain His people. And He's steadfast with us. He's faithful. He's gracious. Remember Psalm 122? Feelings are unreliable in matters of faith. We learn to live not by our feelings, but by the fact of God. And that means refusing to believe my depression and choosing to believe in God. Now, feelings are important. Of course they are. They keep me in touch with reality. They urge me to run when I'm in danger. It's a good thing we have feelings. But they tell us very little about God. My security doesn't come from my feelings. It comes from who God is. And being a disciple is deciding to live by what I know about God, not by what I feel about Him. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds His people. Have you heard of the sword of Damocles? The sword of Damocles. It's a legend that tells us about this courtier, Damocles, in the court of King Dionysius. Being a courtier, he was something of a flatterer, and he would tell Dionysius how lucky the king was to be surrounded with pomp and majesty, to have such great power and authority. Well, one day the king got tired of listening to this flattery, and he offered Damocles the chance to trade places with him so he could experience, this fortune for himself. Damocles jumped at the opportunity and he sat down on the throne. But the king had arranged for a sword to be hung over the throne, suspended by a single horsehair. Guess how long Damocles stayed in that chair? Sometimes we feel that God is like that king, especially when bad things happen to us, when we lose stuff that we feel we can't live without. When pain comes to people we love, we conclude that there's just no justice. I mean, how can God allow this? And so anxiety creeps in, and we get the sensation of living under that sword, the sword of Damocles. When's it going to drop? If it happened to my friend who lived a good life, it's just a matter of time before it happens to me. But the psalmist knew that. We're stressing about a virus right now, but in the Old Testament world, terrible things happened all the time. Just think about the rape and pillage of war, famine, earthquake. Pain and suffering were realities familiar to the people back then. And they didn't have Panados, waiting to be popped from their first aid kits. They didn't have anesthetic in their hospital theaters. So how can the psalmist write so confidently? I think the clue is right there in verse 3. Do you see it? The scepter of the wicked will not remain over the land allotted to the righteous, for then the righteous might use their hands to do evil. And I want you to think about that word remain. The scepter of the wicked will not remain, will not stay there forever. Amen? Folks, I want to say this with all the conviction of Psalm 125 this morning. Evil is not permanent. This will pass. If it was permanent, even the most righteous person would buckle. As the verse says, they might use their hands to do evil. God won't let that happen. Faith will rise. Joy will come in the morning. Evil is always a temporary situation. Let's remember that at a time like this. Just thinking back to that tightrope, and I wonder If you can cast your memory back to the time when you were a child and perhaps walking along a fence or a railway line, you were just so determined to make it to the end, but your friends came along and tried their best to push you off. You know, some people believe that's what our Christian life is like. That we are kind of wobbling and teetering forward, inching our way, taunted by the devil and his demons just wanting to push us off. It's only with some skill and a whole lot of luck that we might just make it to heaven. But even then it's a precarious business. No, not so, says 125. On the contrary, being a Christian is like sitting in a fortress like Jerusalem. We are secure. And that would explain the last verse, verse 5, peace be on Israel. If I could use a more contemporary expression, relax. My sons would tell me, Dad, just chill. We are secure. God is running the show, not your feeling of depression, not your experience of suffering as proof that God abandoned us. Instead, we know God will accomplish His salvation in our lives. I'm so encouraged by what Jesus tells us in the Sermon on the Mount, do not worry. Do you know how many times He tells us that? 3. Not once, not twice, but 3 times, because He knows we will always imagine the worst. And so our path to God is not a tightrope, folks. And instead of a balancing act, I want you to think of a line of mountain climbers kind of making their way up the slope. And they're moving slowly. Don't know if you've seen mountain climbers on television. They're moving deliberately, and they're joined together by a rope. And yes, from time to time, one of them slips, one of them backslides. But everyone doesn't fall down in a heap. Those on their feet are able to arrest the fall of the backslider. And you know what the best news is? Right at the front of that line is the anchor man. He's got his ice pick buried in the rock. And he's a veteran, an experienced climber who knows the pitfalls better than anyone else. Do you know what his name is? He is the author or the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. He knows the ropes, and He will see us home. Shalom.